Hard, I know, to believe it, but I've been doing this financial advising thing for a long time now. Long enough to remember when what is now called inheritance tax was called capital transfer tax. Mrs. Thatcher's Conservative government had promised to abolish CTT, which they did. They changed it to IHT, inheritance tax, which is of course now disliked just as much. It's been extensively tinkered with over the 40 years or so since it arrived. The big changes being the residence nil rate band, introduced to soften the effect of house price rises, which was starting to mean that many more were having to pay tax, and the ability to pass the nil rate band, the inheritance tax allowance, between spouses or civil partners. Now this was very sensible. It used to be use it or lose it, which meant that wills were messed around with to include trusts to pass on half the house when the first of a couple died, and it made life very complicated without much benefit to the Treasury. And it still does very little to help the Treasury. This year, the amount it will raise will be the equivalent of £320 per household. Less than 1% of all tax, enough to keep the NHS going for around 2.5 weeks. A lot of fuss, you could say, about not a lot. But of course, the families of those that are in the net are going to pay an awful lot more than £320. And when, and it looks like when rather than if, pensions become inheritance taxable, that will go up quite a bit for many. Perhaps almost enough to fund another week of waiting outside hospitals in ambulances for many others. What can you do? Well, you can try and spend it, or you can give it away. Neither's easy if most of your money's tied up in your house, or you're worried, as many are quite rightly, about care costs, another nettle which hasn't been grasped and is sadly unlikely to be grasped. Or, as had to be the case when the rules were tighter and allowances lower, well, like they're becoming now, then you could accept there would be a bill for the next generation to pay and decide to pay it at a discount, using life assurance, which in the days when we financial advisors were mostly life insurance salesmen, which we were pretty good at explaining and, well, yes, selling. So here's how it works. The type of life insurance used is what's called a joint life second death policy, which means that it pays out when the second of a couple dies, when everything passes on to the next generation and inheritance tax needs to be paid. We set the policy up in trust, which means it's not included in the estate and is free of IHT. And it's geared to provide enough to pay the bill without, for instance, having to sell a house or use up money that's been passed on and was perhaps held on to in case parents had to go into a home. Now, if you don't wait until it's too late, until you've been ill or are too old, these policies are very good value because two people have to die before they pay out. We can often do the sums and say that provided you're both gone by the time you're 120, you'll have paid in less than is guaranteed to come out at the other end. So you're paying all or part of the inheritance tax bill at a discount. If the rules change and there's too much, well, it's an extra legacy to pass on. Now, the usual objections are, well, why don't we just give it to the children now? They could do with it. The answer, yes, but you'll never get rid of enough to get rid of the inheritance tax. Well, let's ask the kids. And the kids will always say, enjoy yourselves, mum and dad, don't worry about us. And here's where the art of selling actually comes in. Because if you know people can afford it, often we're talking about taking the money from pensions, which they weren't going to touch anyway, for instance. If they can afford it, and if it's a sensible thing to do, helping, not making them see that it is indeed an art. One in which many of us were skilled, but have forgotten. And it's one which really could do more good than harm in the new tax world, in which To quote Paul McCartney, we live in.